You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
You still should be wearing a mask. You still should be trying as best as possible to have that physical distancing.
Nations around the world are still struggling to contain the pandemic. A fresh wave of reported cases in the US has helped push its national COVID-19 death toll towards 120,000. Almost 1/4 of all fatalities worldwide. Brazil, Russia, and India are now struggling to cope with soaring numbers of new infections. And elsewhere around the world, the battle against the second wave of coronavirus continues. Germany recorded 400 new cases of COVID-19 at a meat packing plant. New Zealand, which last week declared it had eliminated the disease, has now recorded 2 new cases imported from the United Kingdom. But in the capital city of China, almost 3 months after flattening the curve of infections and the Communist Party declared victory over coronavirus, the 22 million residents of Beijing find themselves in an entirely unwelcome situation.
Security is tight around a massive Beijing food market that's been linked to a recent surge in COVID-19 cases.
Beijing says that it's in wartime mode, battling its worst virus outbreak since February.
At the center of this new virus cluster in Beijing is the largest wholesale market in Asia.
New fears of a second wave of COVID-19 cases in China as parts of Beijing are forced into lockdown.
Instead of returning to normal life, they find themselves in a situation described as wartime management. Welcome to the Inside China podcast from the South China Morning Post. My name is Mimi Lau, and this week we are taking you to Beijing. After almost 2 months of 0 new local cases of coronavirus, Beijing has been rocked by the news of a significant outbreak. On the weekend of June the 13th, Beijing's biggest wholesale market, the Xinfadi market, was closed after 50 people tested positive to coronavirus. So far, more than 75,000 people have been tested and 79 new infections have been confirmed. You are going to hear from 2 of our reporters in our Beijing bureau, and you have heard from them before on this podcast.
Because when I went to the subways, to the railway stations and shopping malls, I saw so many people still didn't wear masks on January the 20th and the 21st. So when I asked people why they didn't wear masks, and they said it's not that serious, and they said if I were destined to be infected, it's useless for me to wear anything.
Back in our February 8th episode, we first heard from Echo Xie when covering the outbreak in Wuhan, and how she has been dealing with quarantine after managing to get one of the last trains out of the city as the lockdown came into effect right before Chinese New Year.
Because the whole city is locked down, and now outside of every residential blocks, there are people from the government standing outside with a table, several chairs, and the people are limited to go out from the residential compounds. So even though I finished my quarantine, I still cannot go out. I still need to stay at home.
And later in February, we heard from Chen. She reported on how China's netizens were using some very clever techniques to beat the online censorship.
Right after the death of Dr. Li, almost all posts would get taken down, as long as they have a mention of Dr. Li or even just a slight trace of saying something regarding to his death or calling for freer speech or free press.
Now before we get them online, let me give you some background to the Xinfadi market. The full name of the Xinfadi market is Beijing Xinfadi 农产品批发市场 or Beijing Xinfadi Agriculture Produce Wholesale Market. It actually started as a farmer's market in 1985, run by about a dozen or so local villagers. But now, it supplies more than 80% of Beijing's fruits and vegetables, and it takes up more than 100 hectares of space with about 10,000 people working there every day, including restaurants and hotels. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, June the 13th, the Public Health Authority temporarily closed the market and soldiers moved in after a reported COVID-19 outbreak. Now, state media have reported the coronavirus was detected on chopping boards used by a seller of imported salmon. But the scientists are saying the disease can't be transmitted through frozen fish. We are still trying to find out what exactly is happening, so let's get our Beijing bureau on the line. Echo, how did you hear about this outbreak at the Xinfadi market?
I guess it's just like everyone else. I heard about it from a news reporting that one or two people who went to the hospital and they were tested positive for COVID-19, and then they said they went to the Xinfadi food market. And later on, more and more people who have some connection with the market found out positive. So that's what I heard about that.
What is the deeper impact that is happening as a result of this outbreak?
I think the biggest impact right now is the food supply in the city, because I read from news that about 80% of the food and the vegetables in Beijing were from that market. And because of the cases in the market, Beijing has closed at least 6 big food supermarkets in the city. So it is not only one. And the influence for me is I went to a small market in my neighborhood yesterday, and I found that almost half of the shelves were empty, because the staff told me that they couldn't buy any food or vegetables because a lot of the markets are closed. That's the impact for the residents in Beijing on their daily lives.
So Echo, for people who have never seen it, how would you describe Xinfadi market to them?
I went to Xinfadi market 3 years ago, and it is the biggest food wholesale market I've ever been to. It is out of the 4th ring road of Beijing, so it means it is not located in the center of the city. But still, there are so many cars, buses, trucks driving into the place, and the area is very large. And when I went there, I interviewed some people from Shandong and Hebei provinces. So they were farmers in those neighboring provinces, and they transport vegetables to Xinfadi, and they stay there for 2-3 days or even 1 week after they sold out all of the vegetables they had on their trucks, and then they will drove back home. During the maybe 3 days, maybe 1 week, during that time, some of them didn't have a place to sleep. They only sleep in their cars.
Can you help us to put things into perspective? Beijing is 13 times bigger than Los Angeles. How is this lockdown affecting the capital this time?
Well, you're right, because the city of Beijing is so big, and I think the lockdown region is just one part of the city. For example, Beijing has made some medium risk area or low risk area, and for people who live in those medium and higher risk areas, they are asked to get tested. So one of my friends who lives in Fengtai area, she did the test yesterday, required by the government. But for people who live in Chaoyang area, like me, well, I feel my life was not severely influenced, because still I can go to the shopping malls, go to the supermarkets, and I can go to parks or even go to the workplace. Only some indoor venues were closed.
What about schools?
The students went back to their home. I guess a lot of them may need to finish their exams, the final exams at home. and because it is very close to the summer holiday, so maybe they will just wait for the fall semester, I guess.
So when is I always forget the name of it.
The original story from state media seemed to indicate suspicion was on the chopping board for a seafood store where salmon was being sold.
I think till now we don't know about the accurate source of the outbreak. So I think people have two guesses on this. One is that it might be from seafood. And another guess is that it might be transferred from human. For example, some asymptomatic person carried the virus to Beijing and then it spread out in a Xinfadi market. So till now, we don't know about reason. But another thing I want to say is I've read news this morning. So one staff in a restaurant in Tianjin also tested positive, and that staff has never been to Beijing. He has never left Tianjin in the past 14 days. So why is that reason? Can it be linked to seafood? I don't know that, but I think people might be curious about the reason of this.
Can you tell us how did you find out about the outbreak in Xinfadi market last weekend?
So I first heard it just at the newsroom on Friday, where all of the colleagues are talking about it. And then also like in my personal WeChat groups with my friends, like people are starting sharing just kind of tidbits of talk that aren't quite confirmed. You look at the local news, people are saying that, they found a few people that might have visited that market that were confirmed. So that was on June 12th. And back then, things aren't very confirmed. You're just hearing chatters that there's another kind of cluster of new coronavirus patients that is being found in this market.
Can you tell us how are people in Beijing been responding or reacting to this after it has been confirmed? Describe the mood in your neighborhood.
So I would say the general mood in Beijing is now a bit of calm and a bit anxious. It really depends on where you live. So if you live in an area that is less affected, your life isn't that much different. Because prior to this outbreak, Beijing was slowly to loosening up all the checkpoints and all the things. So things were really just about to begin to reopen a week before this outbreak. So for people who are living in less affected areas, you're not going to feel the drastic difference. There's less traffic on the roads, less people commuting, but all in all, not a whole lot changes on the streets. But if you're living in affected neighborhoods, you're living in neighborhoods that are close to the market or neighborhoods that have confirmed cases, then your life is directly impacted. You're likely to be living in a partial lockdown or a full lockdown, depending on how serious your neighborhood is. And then on the internet, that's where a lot of actions are happening, where people really talk about how they really feel. And you can feel the anxious in the air, really. So I think there's two things that people are really worried about. One is they're wondering whether this is going just to be another major outbreak in China. The fact that this current outbreak in Beijing was first found in people who shopped or worked at the Xinfadi food wholesale market, which is another wet market, that brings up quite an unpleasant memory of the first outbreak in Wuhan, where back then the first initial cluster of coronavirus patients was first found working in the Wuhan Huanan seafood market, which is another wet market.
Are people concerned the current outbreak in Beijing, the severity of it might surpass what happened in Wuhan back in Chinese New Year?
Yeah, I would say that's the underlying concern. But so far, the way the authority reacted to the news is quite quick. And people are hoping that it's not going to be as bad as Wuhan.
The cause for that underlying concern is that Xinfadi market is so much bigger
It is one of the biggest wholesale market, at least in northern China. And the market provides about 80% of the produce in Beijing. So it's where Beijing people live on, whether they knew it or not.
We've seen reports that salmon exporters around the world are having their products rejected from Beijing markets. But you have been visiting some Japanese restaurant in Beijing. What have you found out there?
So on Tuesday, I went to 2 Japanese restaurants in Beijing. One restaurant dropped all of their salmon offering. They got an alert notice from their building manager over the weekend and said, you have to take off all of your salmon items. So there were no sashimi, no sushi roll. Basically, all of the salmon items were off the menu in that restaurant. And their sales were slashed by 90%. Yeah, so they were making $1,400 a day before this current outbreak. And then right after the news broke, they were making $140 a day. That was direct impact there. The other restaurant was still offering some salmon item. They dropped the raw items, but they were offering a sushi roll with cooked salmon on top. And when I was there, one couple was ordering that item. So there were some people in the mood for some cooked salmon.
How about other restaurants? Are they being hurt by this as well?
Yeah, definitely. So for the regions that were labeled by the Beijing authorities that was heavy health risks, they're definitely going to see their foot traffic going down. And in some areas, restaurants will be closed. Also, just on the streets, you're seeing kind of a 50 to 60% of a drop in foot traffic in a lot of different areas. So people are trying to stay at home, cook at home as much as possible just to avoid exposing to different kind of risks.
What are the things that people talk about on the street, or are you not hearing much? Are the people avoiding to speak about it in real life?
Yeah, I mean, in real life, you don't hear people talking about it that openly because it is a sensitive topic in a way that it is still under investigation and people don't know where this current outbreak is coming from, like the source of the current outbreak. But online, I have friends that was asking, is salmon or the cutting board of imported salmon really there to blame? It's kind of a logic jump for a lot of people. They can't really grapple around with it. They're like a cutting board, a salmon, and then coronavirus. Like, what is going on here? So that's a big question for a lot of people. Just really, where does this come from? They like to know.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and your on-the-ground reporting. We look forward to have you back again to share with us your latest finding.
Yeah, we're hoping to just find out more about whether this outbreak is growing or slowing or closing. As of now, the Beijing authorities are saying that we might still see an uptick. They don't know where this is going to end. So really just trying to find out more about the future trajectory of this current outbreak.
Thank you, Kin.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is what we have for you right now from Beijing on the latest coronavirus outbreak. And don't forget, this is a developing story. Make sure you keep up with our latest coverage from Beijing and around the world on scmp.com. Thank you so much for sharing this podcast. Make sure you leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. My name is Mimi Lau. Stay safe, stay positive. Until we meet next time.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.